Right.
You want me to put them all in?
Yeah, please. Oh, I think it worked. No.
And then the other tab in the Zoom, you should be good.
Oh, but I got to put this.
Go to this tab.
Yeah, but I got to put this into the temple.
No, it is. I did it.
Oh, it
I don't
is.
know why it came up with my feed.
Oh.
Probably because
Oh.
but I chose it to stream to you guys.
Okay. Launching. Why is it taking so long?
Hi there.
Hi guys, I'm sorry, we're just trying to do the Facebook Live thing and get this all. Oh, there I am. Hi everybody. Nice to see you. You can, for this part, you're welcome to keep yourselves on mute. And then Jason's going to sort of help co-host. We're running late because we're trying to go Zoom straight into Facebook Live, so I don't have to have two devices going at the same time. And then I went into the sanctuary to get something, locked myself out. I go around. Here we are, and we're running on Steve time. Jason, I'm glad you're here. Is everybody in the room right now? And can everybody hear? Good. So I thought to begin, we would first recognize that today is Yom HaZikaron. Right now in Israel, it is Yom HaTzmaut already because it's after sunset. And later on, we're going to talk about why the state of Israel, in picking these three holidays that are not biblical, not Talmudic, Yom HaShoah, which was last week, Holocaust Day, Memorial Day, Israel Memorial Day, which is today, and Yom HaTzmaut, which begins tonight, why they were selected and put in the places in which they were put. And why we go right from Memorial Day into the celebratory Yom HaTzmaut, all in a 48-hour period, and how many people, including myself, see that as a little bit bipolar. But nonetheless, Jason, really quickly, how again do I post the, I go to share screen for the, oh, here it is. I'm just gonna get, there we are. Okay, so that is the title for today. We're gonna get to that in a second. But seeing as how it is Yom HaZikaron, I thought we could begin with a moment of silence and hear the siren as the siren is in Israel during the 1 minute. For those of you who, like Jason and I, have been in Israel during either Yom HaShoah or Yom HaZikaron, no. There's a moment during the daytime where the air raid siren goes off and everybody stops what they're doing, literally pulls their car to the side if they're driving, to the side of the road safely, and opens their door and stands outside. And there's an air raid siren for a minute to remember those who have fallen in all of Israel's wars. So I thought we would start with that, with a moment of silence for the soldiers and civilians of the state of Israel who have given their lives for the Jewish homeland. Well, thank you very much for that moment of silence. So what I want to do, I want to try to do a couple of things today, and I'm glad I scheduled it to go until actually a little bit later, although I do have to pretty much stop at 1 o'clock, but if we have some extra time or need some extra time, we can always set up a time for us to talk. So I thought we would look at two articles. I'd like everyone to please utilize the comment section. Jason will jump in and let me know when the questions come up or your comments come up. And then if you feel like you need to say something, there is a place on Zoom where you can raise your hand, and you can also just jump in. I know there are all these protocols for Zoom, but you know me, I like participation and group participation. So I want you to feel free to jump in. So we're going to read two articles. One was from the New York Times from last week about, and it's so funny because Jason, well, the article's not funny at all, but Jason actually spoke about this on Friday night during Shabbat services. And this has to do with a hospital that allowed people over the last month to say goodbye to their loved ones. I have officiated 3 funerals this past month for our congregation. And in one case, 2 of the people actually died in their homes. But in one case, a woman had been in the hospital with infections and nothing coronavirus related. But, you know, she had pneumonia and she was in ICU, and her husband went literally 2 weeks plus, her husband of 60 years almost, not seeing her before she died. And I just broke my heart. And as we know from our anecdotally, or from even people we know, it's been hard for people to not be able to say goodbye to loved ones because of protocols. So the first article is from the Times, and it deals with this hospital's decision to allow people to say goodbye. The second one is a blog from the Times of Israel by our good friend, Rabbi Daniel Gordis. And I thought we would end with that one because it's much more promising and positive. But I do want to ask you, because I want us to also check in with each other. So that second blog, second post is called Only Here, and it has to do with Erev Shabbat and Kabbalat Shabbat in Jerusalem. So we'll get to that. And I've highlighted on the slideshow some of the key points. Just by show of hands, was anyone able to read the articles beforehand? I put them in the links, but I know that sometimes that's tricky. No? Some? Oh, okay. And you probably had heard about some of this? That's been the hospital visitation part in Israel. So I called this Only in Israel because there's a great Hebrew song called Rabbi Israel, Only in Israel. And it's sort of like a kid's song, which means that Jason and I learned it in Ulpan, because that's what they teach you in Ulpan, is a lot of children's music. Because for, you know, remedial Hebrew students like me, they figure they'll teach the language by teaching children's songs.
Rabbi, can
Yes.
we chat?
Yeah, do you have a question about the song?
Yeah, I don't mean to be defensive on behalf of hospitals, even though I was the chairman of Banner.
Yeah.
Some of those protocols were established by our friends in the government, and the hospitals had a.
We'll get to that. We'll get to that. And I don't mean to be bashing the hospital system at all.
And I don't mean to be defensive.
I'm sure. Well, as you know, our good friend Laszlo from Torah Study, who's a hospitalist in an ICU.
Yes.
We've been talking a lot, and what we see on the news and what's actually happening in the hospitals are completely different, and that's I guarantee. But let's save that for later on, because I want to I want to see what went into what my point is, and I think what our point is that this is the Jewish response that only can happen in Israel, only can happen in the Jewish state. So forgive my Zionist agenda, but that's what we're looking at today on these two issues of where Israel has kind of done, as they always do, innovative and creative things. I mean, they did create the internet. And although the guy who created Zoom, I understand his personal wealth has gone up like $100 gazillion in the last month. Nonetheless, I'm sure there's some aspect of Zoom that Israel created. Okay, so the first article from the Times begins as follows. Does someone want to unmute themselves and just read this little slide for us?
Well, I will, Rabbi.
Oh, okay, thank you.
A few people had already died.
Wayne, you're on deck.
Can I go ahead?
Please.
A few people had already died alone of the coronavirus at Tel Aviv Saransky Medical Center when the hospital spokesman put to his bosses a question that had been gnawing at him. Why had it been permissible for him to let a few journalists put on protective gear, and come to see the coronavirus ward. The spokesman, Avi Shushan, asked, but families of the patients were being kept out, entirely denied the chance to bid their loved ones a final farewell. No one had a good answer. Israeli hospitals were neither so overrun nor their supplies of masks.
Sorry.
The compassion had to be another casualty of the crisis, said Roni Gamzu, the chief executive of Saransky. And so on the spot, the hospital's management committee unanimously voted to change its policy.
Jason, the hospital that you mentioned in your sermon on Friday night was not this hospital, right?
No, it was another one.
It was the one in Beersheba?
No, outside of Tel Aviv. I'll
So
check
it was
the
like a
name.
major trauma hospital, right?
Exactly, and the largest hospital in Israel.
Oh, wow. Okay. So I don't know if this took place after, during, before that hospital made its decision, but this is Tel Aviv's big hospital, a major medical center. And they're put to this test, and this is a very fair question. Why are journalists allowed to go into, as we've seen, go into these wards, these ICUs, these special COVID wards, but loved ones, the closest ones to these people, are not able to? And as it said, no one had a good answer. Now, I can tell you, in the state of Israel, my guess is for a lot of us in our work lives, the idea of there's no good answer means one of two things. Either we hunker down and dig in to whatever our position is, or we say, oh, there's no good answer, let's try to find a good answer to this. And so underlying, I am going to overplay Israel's role in creative innovation today. That's always my but with these things at least. But they didn't have a good answer. And so the committee got together and has this conversation. Okay, Elaine, you're up. And I've skipped around for those of you who did not read the entire article. They kind of go back and forth into some information about COVID and some personal sharing of some personal stories, but I wanted to just do the highlights of the article for the purposes of our session. So Elaine, you want to read this?
Okay. The hospital's revived policy, which several other Israeli hospitals has now also embraced, limits visits to 1 or 2 relatives per patient and a half an hour at bedside. Most are in and out in 15 minutes or less, officials said. Dr. Gamzu said that in barring family visits entirely before April 2nd, his hospital, like countless others worldwide, had taken what he called the international default position. But this was not purely rational, he said. We had anxiety, narrow thinking, and a little bit of hysteria, and we were too conservative, he said. We're putting all our energy into medical issues and too little into loneliness and compassionate care. While Israel's hospitals have not been overrun like those in some countries, Dr. Gamzu insisted that supply shortages were not an adequate excuse. Family visits, he said, require less than 1% of all the personal protective equipment the hospital uses. You don't want to invest 1% for being human, he asked.
Very good. Any responses? Anyone want to jump in here and make a comment about this, how they sort of arrived at their decision? Yeah, Elaine.
I have to tell you, my hiking group, I still meet my ladies twice a week to walk, and we talk about this every time. It's the first thing somebody says. Can you imagine having someone and not being able to go in and say goodbye?
Right.
I think that's true. Everybody looked at the big picture, which is scary, and they forgot about the people. But I do know that if you watch the news, countless nurses have come on and said, we don't want you to think they're dying alone. We're there. We think, I say, if that was my mother, if that was my sister, which I'm not sure how much that helps if that's your parent or your sister or your brother, but it's nice to know that in the midst of all this chaos, they can still look at it that way.
Right.
Yeah, but
and it says if in what you just read also, the quote, I was actually really moved by this quote. We had anxiety, and narrow thinking and a little bit of hysteria, and we were too conservative, he said. I mean, that has been, I think, a perfect depiction, that is a perfect depiction of every conversation we seem to be engaging in these days, where there's anxiety and irrational, depending on who you are, right?
Right.
What your idea of rational is.
Right.
And hysteria, and we're scared, right? First sermon I gave a few weeks ago on this was living in fear and living with fear. And I want us to, in the back of our minds, because at the end, we're going to do some checking in for those who are comfortable. And you're welcome to write this in the comments now, a word or two about how you're feeling. Because I'm guessing that it's one of those things. Like when we are narrow thinkers and we know that we're being a narrow thinker, how do we get out of that? If we're being histrionic, how do we get out of that? And knowing that right now, it's sort of like being in mourning. We're inside, right? The Talmud says that there's two spheres. There's a private sphere and a public sphere. And we're all in the private sphere, even if we're walking with our friends, we're living a life in the private sphere, and that's not what human beings are supposed to be doing. That's why Shiva is only 7 days, right? And then you go into Shloshim, where you're allowed to enter back into the public sphere. This is going on 7 weeks, so 6 weeks. So it's all sort of antithetical to Jewish thinking. So he talks about that anxiety, and they weren't having supply shortages and all that. And he said, you know, the math was right. It's less than 1% of all the protective equipment, and you don't want to invest 1% for being human, right? So already we start to see creeping into this what I would say Jewish values. And what is the Jewish value here that's going to sort of win the day? That you know.
I just want to give another
Wendy.
viewpoint. Yeah, I want to give another viewpoint here. First of all, we do have a friend, an elderly friend. Her husband had cancer. She had to drop him off at the hospital, and then he died. That was the last she saw of him, unfortunately. But I also want to give my viewpoint as a former reporter. And as much as I feel for these people, they can say goodbye virtually. You're putting a lot of people at risk. If you have 1 or 2 reporters come in, that's 1 or 2 reporters for the entire hospital.
Mm-hmm.
That's not the sheer number of people, because the most important thing in Judaism is to preserve life. And you're putting so many people at risk. I mean, I know of somebody, and all she did was go into a store a couple of times. She had masks, she had gloves, and she's recovering from COVID after a really hard time now.
Mm-hmm.
So I really think this has to be balanced. I mean, luckily, and we're fortunate. I mean, now that we're pretty much over the shock, things have gone back into kind of a normal swing in a sense. I mean, I am really, my heart sings when I see on YouTube all these orchestra members and choir members getting together, and they're still doing what they always did. They're just doing it differently.
Mm-hmm.
And maybe it would
Thank
be.
you. And Wendy, I appreciate that, because I want there to be a balanced conversation when we describe not only what we're feeling, but what our reality is and how we see things. I hope that one of the silver linings from this situation has been our ability to sort of open our hearts and minds a little bit and understand not only do people think different thoughts about things, and we don't have to share a mind, but that we have to also tolerate ambiguities. I mean, that's a really big part of life. So on the one hand, you're right, there's this Jewish value, pikuach hanefesh, saving a life, the value that your body is a sanctuary and must be taken care of, the value of being protective of your loved ones and yourself. There's also these values of the minyan, of the quorum, and what's good for the community. When a holiday cancels out Shiva or Shloshim, literally stops your mourning period, it's because the celebration, if you will, of the community takes a higher, at least in Jewish law, has a higher obligation to do what the rest of the community is doing vis-a-vis celebrating the holiday than what your individual needs are. So all of these things exist. So I appreciate you saying this. Does someone want to read the next page, and then we'll get more comments throughout. And I see we're up to 30 participants. But again, in the comment section, I want to say I do want to respond to Elaine's comment about do not resuscitate in a moment. Very important. David Wolpe, Rabbi David Wolpe of Sinai Temple, I'll try to give you the link, Elaine, gave a very powerful sermon this last Shabbat about orders, DNRs and things like that for your loved ones. And really powerful. And if you don't watch that and go and call the estate planner, immediately, I don't know what will help you to do so. Okay, someone else want to read? You can unmute yourself and read.
Can I
Stan.
have a question? Yeah.
Oh, you have a question? Yes.
I know the visitations in Israel by family are very short-lived, and I know the data would only be anecdotal, but is there any data yet as to what happened to the family visitors? Have they had a higher incidence of?
I don't know. I don't know. That's a great question. Jason, do you know any of that? Jason's my go-to guy for anything scientific.
I didn't.
He's our family statistician.
I did not see anything on it, but I know that they were behind glass at all times.
That's right. It's in the picture in the article.
It's a question of who else was in that hospital, right? So there might have been other family members who potentially could have been sick from their family or other families that they would have seen in the hospital.
Right. And they could have already been exposed, and maybe they already have the antivirus. I mean, we don't know. I don't know. And I wouldn't even know how. I guess you'd have to do the testing on the way in and then on the way out, and then a couple weeks later, I guess.
Yes.
I did have the antibody testing myself this last weekend, and I was negative for both. So I'm thinking, I've been around a lot of people in January, February, March. Who knows? I think this thing is all very random, and there's all the positive negatives and negative positives, and flip a coin. I mean, it's craziness. All right, who wants to read next about this next part?
I'll read.
Thank you. And Kathy, you got it.
Thank you. Dr. Gamzu said allowing deathbed visits did not just benefit the relatives. It provided an enormous psychological relief to hospital workers.
So this goes back to the point that Wendy was making also before, or someone was making before as well, about virtual nurses being good at using their Facebook lives, whatever the technology is called, so that people could be there and reassuring families that they were checking in on them and so on and so forth. Please continue.
Imagine the stress and emotional burden on people who see the patient dying and the relatives are outside and you have only a remote connection with them, he said. Once you let the relatives in, then you let your staff disconnect a little bit. They are not the focus of the burden. However,
can we just stop there for 1 second?
Sure.
Does anyone have a response or reaction to that? Is anyone here in a helping profession, or you've been a nurse, or you've been a teacher, or you've been around people, caring for people, and you know what that feeling is? And you can take that burden off your shoulders just a tiny bit.
Rabbi?
Yes, Carol.
Not in the health profession or anything, but I just want to make a comment about that, because last night on the news, speaking to the psychological relief, one of the internists, who an ER doc, she actually killed herself.
Oh.
She went home and she killed herself. She could not handle the stress anymore of what was going on and all the patients dying. So to relieve that, to have that psychological relief, I think is a blessing.
Thank you, Carol. Thanks for sharing that.
One thing that I'm not in the caregiving profession, but I work with a lot of them.
Well, you kind of are in the caregiving.
So one thing that's really at the top of our list at JFCS is our staff, and it's hard to talk about it publicly because it seems a little self-serving. But they are all in a very unusual and intense, real situation where not only is their job in caring for vulnerable populations already
Right.
difficult on themselves. But now we have this multiplier that has just expanded, and there's no end. And the work keeps layering and layering and layering. And as time moves on, it gets more and more intense with new issues and problems. And just any sort of, I can really relate to what this author was depicting, because any sort of moment that they can release themselves just for a bit is like respite care for the care worker, if that makes sense.
100%. Which many do with also a feeling of guilt and a little bit of, I'll tell you, just amongst us, rabbis have a problem of, I call it implicit martyrdom. And that means that we don't know when to say, oh, this is impacting me, maybe I should take a step away rather. And I remember in my first or second year of rabbinic school, Lee Beisel, who was the dean of the LA campus, told us, he was very blunt about it, like, let's be honest, we all like being liked. It's like a drug. And you'll start doing things that are not in your best interest to be liked. So it's nice, and you're saying it too, Gail, is at some point, everybody hits the wall. So to have a little bit of relief, and you're seeing it, from the administrative point of view from Edgeworth Family and Children's, because you have so many people there who are working. And so when you're in leadership, you start to hear these stories and anecdotes. And what Carol said is, it'll be very sad, I think, when we get to the other side of this, to see who just couldn't take it anymore and either tried to take their own life or took their own life. It's like psychiatrists, and other helping professions that have high rates of suicide. At some point, you hit the wall. Okay, Kathy, please keep going.
Howard Oster, chief of the internal medicine ward that is handling coronavirus patients, described that precise feeling. We had a patient come in who shortly afterward passed away, and I had to tell his two sons that their father had just died, he said. We were standing in the hallway with masks on, and I had to tell them, if that's not bad enough.
Sorry.
Where are we? I'm sorry.
I know, I did that. I pushed the wrong button.
Okay, and I had to tell them, if that's not bad enough, you won't be able to see your father. That was horrible. That was an experience I will never forget.
Yeah. Yeah. And we can intellectualize it and say, I'll just share this anyway. So my dad, as you know, died in the beginning of March, and he, as it turns out, he probably died at the home that he was living in. Of course, they did not follow the DNR that they had. And so when I met with the doctor at what used to be PV Hospital, it's got another name now, I was still able to go and see him and say, "We doey," and have a good cry. Now you're not allowed to do that. And this was March 8th, so it was right at the beginning of all this. I think they asked me if I had a temperature on my way in, and that was about it. But at least I got to have closure. I got to see him. And as the doctor is saying here is, if that's not bad enough, you're not going to be able to see your dad who just died. And that's our reality right now. And that is just so terribly painful to hear. Again, people are not with their parents always or with their loved ones always when they actually die, but we at least get to see them at some point, even though it's their body, and in Judaism, we believe their soul is already transitioning. It is closure, and it's a very important thing. Kathy.
Yeah, yesterday on KTAR radio, in the afternoon, one of the hosts was talking. His father passed away in New York. And he, of course, was not able to go back to New York. He was not able to see his father at the end. And it's been very, very difficult for him. The only thing that at this point he can say is his father had had cancer. He was looking forward to more surgeries. And so at least that was something that they didn't have to deal with and his father didn't have to endure. But it's awful not to be able to be with your loved one, to have that closure and to have allowed them to feel your love one last time.
Yeah, absolutely. Is there anyone else? I can't see all the screen, so I just want to be sensitive. Herbert?
I would like to say something, but I don't know how I do it.
I can hear you.
Okay. I hope nobody else in this Lunch and Learn has had the experience that I had 3 weeks ago. I can speak from personal experience to this problem. I had not been able to see my wife for 3 weeks because of the lockdown, unable to touch her or to show my interest or my love. She had a sudden episode that took her to the hospital. Although she did have a DNR, the night before the last day there, I was told that there was no hope for any quality of life. And so we decided to do the DNR. The next morning I was called from the hospital and was told that they would make, this was not coronavirus incidentally, that I would be able to come in that morning at a time that I wished. I was able to spend the last 3 hours of her life holding her hand and kissing her forehead. I will be forever grateful to the intensive unit at Scottsdale Shea for allowing to bend the rules and allow me to have. I would love for anybody to have that opportunity if they wish. And I think the humanism is extremely important.
Yeah. Well, Herb, before you came on, I, without naming you, was telling people about just briefly about your experience, and I remember our phone calls that week. I mean, I still don't know to this day how you were able to not just barge in there and, you know, pull out your doctor card and say, hey, I can handle this. And from what I understand from your visit, it wasn't about wearing a full PPE either. I mean, it was really about the humanity of it. And thank God, as you said, that you were able to do that and had a doctor who was able to think humanely as well.
Good. I've appreciated this very much. This is the discussion. And I hope I contributed to it.
100%. Thank you. So we cut the article. I cut the article off because I wanted to get to the just to respect everyone's time. Yeah, just 1 second, Sam. I just wanted to read, and then I want to hear what you have to say. I just want to read one other part of the article where it sort of ends, and again, you can print this up. But in the end, Dr. Oster talks about how this gives him a sense of comfort. And so, Herb, I want you to know that in some way you brought comfort to the doctors and the nurses because they got to experience what it was that you were doing, because I'm sure the guilt that they were feeling was enormous as well. Not just the guilt, but the whole gestalt, if you will, of care, which is to care for patients, to care for other human beings. So he says in the article, Dr. Oster, that there was some benefit to patients from compassionate family visits, though with cautious, precautions being taken. He said, ask me that, he said, if it turns out by some stroke of grace of God that one of these patients actually rallies when they're being touched by their family member or seen by their family member. Dr. Rinat Vida Dishlo is convinced of the benefits, it says. On Thursday, her two siblings visited their mother, Batsheva, who was 74, after the hospital let them know that she was rapidly declining. On Sunday, her mother was still holding on, and the hospital bent its rules to give Miss Vida Dishlo, 41, her own chance to say goodbye. So, there is this idea of not being alone and not wanting our loved ones to die alone. And that is the other part of this Jewish values conversation. So when we say only in Israel, I think Israel, these hospitals in Israel, again, that Jason spoke about last Shabbat and that have been making these decisions are really, clearly caught in this paradox, but at the same time wanting to do what is best for the patient and best for the family on an emotional level, even with the medical or physical risks that exist. So, Sam.
My experiences were different, of course, because it happened a while ago. I do know how important it is for the person, the survivor, to be there, to be able to speak to that person. I was told that the last function of the person dying that goes is the hearing, that they can still hear. I was there for my daughter and my wife both times.
Yeah.
And for me, it was, very important that the person be there.
Thank you. I want to thank you guys very much for sharing that. And I want to acknowledge that when we talk about these things and we experience them and we see them on TV, for all of us, it can trigger a lot of big feelings as well. And so again, we'll get to that in a moment. I want to change gears now and go to a happier, but nonetheless, I think very Israeli perspective from Rabbi Danny Gordis in an blog that he entitled Only Here. So this first part's a little bit long. Does someone want to read who's got some pace? Because we've got about 20 minutes left, so I want to make sure we get some of this in.
I'll do it.
You got it.
All right. As we heard our Jerusalem neighbors' Shabbat prayers, I thought, we are locked down in one place Jews would want to be locked down. It sounded as if the voice was coming from the stones. Every evening, as nightfall comes to Jerusalem, the buildings here, chameleon-like, change their colors. The streets in our neighborhood are quiet on Shabbat in any event, but lately they've been almost ghostly, eerily silent. Nothing about the neighborhood has changed, but everything is different. So when Shabbat began the week before last with that slightly golden tint coloring, the buildings, as the angle of the light shifted before the sun was gone, my wife and I stepped outside onto the terrace to breathe it all in. We'd expected the usual quiet, the sound of a little more than the birds and those proverbial Jerusalem cats. They were there to be sure. But then, as we stared out over the railing towards the building next door and the street below, there was a voice. You could have mistaken it for the Mizun, as we often hear around here, bellowing from amplifiers and speakers in mosques closer to the old city. But this was no Mizun. This was Hebrew.
So everybody, I don't know if everybody here has been to Jerusalem. Carol Seidberg and Ken and I had the honor of having lunch with Rabbi Gordis in his neighborhood during our last trip to Israel. So it's a neighborhood called Tapiot. It's got a lot of expatriates and from the United States, and really good restaurants and a good buzz to it. For those of you who've been to the main campus of the joint agency in Israel, it's right in that vicinity. And I love it how he describes the sun setting and the colors changing on the Jerusalem stone and all of that stuff. So they go out on their balcony, he and his wife, and they start to hear this Hebrew. So let's see what happens. Oh, sorry. Let me just make sure I'm on the right slide. Okay. Who'd like to read? Oh, it got a little bit cut off here. So let me just, I'm going to read, okay? Because I think that one page got cut off. So let me read there. We craned our necks to no avail. We couldn't see where it was coming from, but as the voice grew clearer, we quickly realized it was Kabbalat Shabbat, which is the service where we sing Lecha Dodi and Psalms before we get to the Baruch Hu. From a porch somewhere or from a window, maybe even a rooftop, who knows? Someone had taken it upon himself, with all the synagogues closed, to gather together all the neighbors who couldn't see and maybe don't even know each other, to sing and to pray together from this one balcony. It was Shabbat in Jerusalem, after all. We were in isolation. Whoever he was saying, but we weren't going to be isolated. In other words, yes, we're all alone, but we're not going to be isolated. And so he starts singing some Mizmor Shir L'Yom HaShabbat or Lecha Dodi or any one of the preliminary songs that we sing at Shabbat services. Okay, so now someone can take over. So instead of praying, where it says so instead of praying. Elaine, you can keep going if you'd like.
So instead of praying downstairs in my study alone, as I'd done for weeks now, we found ourselves together on the porch, singing with people whom we'll never be able to identify, our collective voices rebounding off the buildings. As we were singing, mesmerized by the strangeness, but also the wonder of the moment, it struck me, those very words, those exact same words, have been rebounding off of buildings around here for thousands of years. Many of the words we were singing were debated by the rabbis of old. The Talmudic tractate Barachot is a record of many of their conversations about what precisely the wording should be. And for millennia now, we've been doing more or less what they prescribe. These neighborhoods, these hills, these stones have been hearing those echoing words for thousands of years.
Does anyone want to react to that? Kathy, you've got such a beautiful look on your face. You've got that feeling. You've got not only that Shabbat feeling, but a real sense of what he's saying. Does anyone want to share what they're thinking?
I'd like to share something.
Please.
Can you hear me?
Of course.
Oh, good. Okay. So a cousin of ours has a home in Jerusalem, and Jeffrey and I were there one Shabbat. I think the first Shabbat we ever spent in Jerusalem, and we had dinner on Judy's porch. And the porch was open on all sides, and she had this magnificent Shabbat dinner. And as we were sitting there, we heard all the prayers from all of the different houses around her. And they were all in different parts. They weren't all in unison, but we were able to share emotionally and auditorily, I guess, all of these people praying in just a fire of gorgeous Hebrew that was so very profound to me. And the opposite of that was Jews praying together on a Shabbat night. But we were also blessed to be in Jerusalem on Yom Kippur. And we were in the Agron Street Synagogue, which is also surrounded by 5 or 6 other major synagogues, including the Great Synagogue. And we walked outside after Yom Kippur, and it was just total silence. But there were probably, I don't know, 500 or 600 people in the streets walking, not a sound to be heard. But in that silence was the voice of everyone. So it was really quite a juxtaposition to be able to hear everybody out loud praying together on Shabbat and everybody being together in silence on Yom Kippur. It was something I'll never forget.
Yes, and that goes to the Only in Israel title. In other words, I think that these are the experiences that we can only have there. And I know exactly what you're talking about from Yom Kippur. For those of you who don't know, the Grove Street Synagogue, which is where the conservative movement's headquarters in Israel are, is kitty corner to the Great Synagogue, which is a very large Orthodox synagogue. It's great, which is across the street from what used to be the Sheraton. I don't know what it is now. And it's in a neighborhood called Rehavia. So you've got those two synagogues there. And I remember the year I lived in Israel, the whole month of Elul, 6 a.m., 5 a.m., whenever people were doing shacharit, hearing shofarot from various synagogues, which could have been in someone's apartment, going off for, a good 15, 20 minutes. You would hear the Slichot, month of Slichot shofars sounding during that time. It's very powerful. But what Rabbi Gordis is saying is exactly what you described, is this idea of prayer, spontaneous, harmonious prayer coming from all kinds of balconies throughout his neighborhood. All right, I'm going to read a little bit because I do want to respect the time. Only here, where am I? So there's some other, you should read the entire blog. It's kind of cool. Only here is the point of this week, now dawning in Israel. So this was written last week. What struck me out on the porch was that though we were locked down for who knows how long, many of us feel that we were locked down in the one place Jews would want to be locked down. For if only these stones could speak, they'd tell you our roots are here, like they are nowhere else, literally nowhere else. To be here is to be part of a story. To be here is to play a tiny role in writing the next chapter. I remember that some years ago, when the mood was very different, or when the world was very different, there was a rooftop minyan in our neighborhood. The apartment building was at the top of the hill. So on a clear evening, we could see the entire city, Mount Scopus, the Mount of Olives to the north, Hilo to the south. When my son came home from the army one Friday and stood at my side, taking in the truly extraordinary view, I said to him, a lot of history has unfolded out there over the centuries. Without missing a beat, he turned to me and said, it still is.
Good point.
Yeah. If you go to the, I'm going to skip to the end here because I want to make sure we have a little bit of time. But here there's yet another layer. None of us wants this pandemic to mark the end of our lives. But the older we are, the more we know that it could. The likelihood may not be high, but it's not statistically insignificant either. So we find ourselves talking to each other and to friends about what really matters, and often about the fact that we're here and nowhere else, about the fact that if heaven forbid this pandemic were to exact the ultimate price, this is where we would want to be. Even in the face of fear and hunger. I'm sorry. I'm going to let someone else read this because I don't have it in front of me totally. Someone want to read?
Yeah, even in the face of the fear, the hunger, the anguish, and the unknown, many people in these neighborhoods will spend this very strange week heartbroken, to be sure, but also grateful beyond words to be in with people whose lives are statements about where they want to be no matter what. Only here.
Okay, so in this week of Yom HaAtzmaut, Yom HaZikaron, Yom HaShoah, there's this statement of the feelings of being in Jerusalem, in the center of the Jewish world, and being connected. Now, I would argue that is something that we have also provided for each other here. But I wanted to ask you before we end, where are you at? What has changed for you in your Jewish mindset or from a Jewish mindset? What do you think? We all experience things differently, but I think it's safe to say this has been an incredibly, incredibly traumatic time for us as individuals. And so I'm not saying let's open up into a group session. I'm a pastoral counselor, but not qualified to do group leading. But some of you have mentioned very powerful words and emotions. What do you think, or that you've talked about or thought about, is different, better, worse, Doesn't matter. What's different for you? And where has Judaism, I think what Rabbi Gordis is saying, not only Judaism, but living in Israel has been this profound experience during these days. So I just wanted to throw that out there for a few minutes.
Rabbi?
Yeah.
I think what this has done for me, and part of it is just the aging process, I've learned that some of the things that I thought were important are really not, and that things that used to upset me or set me off in some way aren't important anymore. And I concentrate on living and family and love rather than things which were not right before. It seemed to be unimportant today.
Thank you. That's incredible. Thank you.
Well, Rabbi, without sounding tone deaf, I dislike everything's going on with regard to the pain that people are suffering. But, I see at the end, if there is an end or a transition, I see a lot of good things happening. I mean, with regard to the healthcare organization, they're suffering great pain, as are the patients, and as are their finances, and they're going to have to get their collective act together. Schools, you name it. And as far as Congregation Beth Israel is concerned, well, I want to go to Torah study and the Saturday morning and the Friday night. I've got to tell you, what you guys are doing is really great. I mean, it's important. It's educational as well as from a religious standpoint, serious. I get touched by the music. I get touched by the service, and you're really doing it very well.
Thank you.
Not a permanent condition, you understand, but
you bet.
The timing.
Thank you.
Rabbi, can I just briefly? So I am,
of course.
I'm a counselor in behavioral health, and our clinic that I'm working for currently switched gears so that we're providing services uninterrupted using Zoom. And the appreciation on behalf of the clients has been extraordinary, sort of that continue to connect sort of in an environment we're being told not to connect. And I've also witnessed an extraordinary level of resilience. A number of individuals who suffer prior to this event from debilitating anxiety and depression, and they're finding sort of this collective sort of normalcy with everything that's going on. And in that normalcy, they're finding comfort and solace and being able to sort of comfort and care and connect with other individuals, and they feel normalized in some way. So it's been sort of an extraordinary and rewarding experience from sort of an individual working with people.
Jennifer, do you think that in sort of an ironic way, it's made them feel less isolated and alone?
Oh, for sure.
Which is so ironic.
It's ironic. Absolutely. Yeah.
But incredibly powerful.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And sort of an ability to feel safe, allowing themselves to express vulnerabilities. And I think that's kind of what we're all experiencing, is being able to sit here with a number of people who we know or don't know. And we have the connection of being Jewish and sort of the congregation, but we're all feeling safe to express our vulnerabilities and our concerns.
Yeah.
And I think that's a gift.
Right.
I think something that we're able to feel, I think I've always been sort of lucky that I can be alone, but not be lonely. A lot of people can't do that. They need constant people, and they don't know how to get in touch with themselves. And I think that it's a wonderful opportunity to try to know yourself better and to be able to be alone, but not lonely. Hard to do.
I'm just going to chime in really quickly, but one of the fundamental ideas in Judaism, and I know we don't all believe in this, but I just want to lay that out there. is that you're never alone because God exists. Like, you're never alone. But that manifests itself very differently for a lot of people. I see, like, for example, one of my kids is really struggling with that, being alone. She loves camp and she loves with her friends and she loves, that's what makes her happy, right? And so this has been really hard. For others, not as much. They kind of like the downtime, so to speak. But you're right. But it's different for everyone. But not. We see the face of God in each other's faces, and that's not Triton Judaism. That's just one of our fundamental ideas. Easier said than done. One more, because I do see that we're over time, and I want to be respectful. I think it's very clear that we're going to have more conversations about this particular part of what we're experiencing, because we don't get to talk about it enough. And I'm so grateful that people feel safe and comfortable enough to do so. Yeah.
And I feel very blessed because I'm still working and I've always worked from home. And it's somewhat transition, but yet I'm finding listening to the news and I'm crying more often. I'm not getting out seeing people because I'm used to being at home, but I'm also used to going out after work and those types of things. I consider myself blessed in that respect, that I am still working. And it's still emotional, though, to watch the news and to watch people are suffering. I just pray my uncle's okay, my brother's okay, and yet we're all here. And I appreciate it because this is a lunch and learn for me. And glad I took the time out to listen to this. Thank you, Rabbi.
Oh, I want to thank everybody here. I know we all have more to say, and I want to just respond really quickly to one of the comments. And Gail, I think you hit it on the head here, is this whole system is verklempt right now, especially for people who, and I know that you wrote this comment a little while back, but this idea that people that are left behind and the Jewish system of mourning with the community and the virus has just been so disruptive. And I think for our next time together, one of the things that we can look at and study together is this idea of what happens in trauma, or from trauma, I should say. Our archetypes in Torah, in Bible, are Sarah and Abraham is the perfect example of leaving home, getting away from everything that's familiar, going fully blind, if you will, from where they grew up to Canaan. The commentaries on that really speak about, and again, I call them archetypes because I think that they can speak to us now, like the stones in Jerusalem spoke to Danny Gordis, that from sort of this blind walking that we're doing right now and this disruption that we're feeling, when we get to the other side of it, it is, I believe, our faith. And as Jeff said, that delineation between knowing what is and isn't important. And as Jennifer said, the ability to know that we're not alone, or at least be surrounded by other people who are validating our feelings. I think from all of that, I really hope we continue to sort of be bound together and realize that there's going to be a lot of messiness. There is a lot of messiness, but there's going to be a lot of messiness that plays out in a variety of ways. And I'm proud that we've consistently been able to be together to remind each other of, as Jeff said, what is and is not important. So we're going to be providing you with the May schedule, and we'll have some more lunch and learns to share. And I'm going to probably try to get on either next Tuesday or the week after, and we can continue this conversation. I think it's really important. All right. And Marty, thank you for your kind words. We'll see you all very, very soon.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Happy birthday, Israel.
Stay safe.
Thank you, Rabbi.
You're welcome. Thank you all.
Thank you, everyone.
And thank you, Jason.
Bye.